There is a lot of confusion as to how good Pelé actually was. How many of Pelé's goals were scored in his back garden? Let's find the facts and bust the myths to find the shocking truth about Pelé. If you asked Pelé how many goals he scored in his career, he would have said 1,283. The Guinness World Records and Football Chart believe he scored 1,279. Yet, FIFA state Pelé scored 757 goals. So, what is the truth? Well, in official competition, Pelé did score 778 goals, but his inflated tally comes from friendly matches and tour games that Santos would play at the time. He also counted games he played for the 6th Coast Guard in a military competition against non-professionals. Furthermore, as a Brazilian side, Santos would often tour Europe in order to test themselves against the so-called world's best teams. However, friendly games usually aren't counted as official matches, so 778 is Pelé's true tally, if we're counting his goals in the same way we would any other player. Even still, Pelé's goal scoring numbers are nothing short of ridiculous, and while he didn't truly break that 1,000 goal barrier, he still remains one of the greatest goal scorers in the history of this sport. Another argument surrounding Pelé is the fact he scored goals in the Brazilian league, which would be easier than, let's say, scoring goals in the top European leagues. However, during the 1960s, the Brazilian league was arguably the strongest domestic competition in the world. Certainly, it contained some of the game's best players of the time. Every one of the 1958 World Cup winning squad had been playing in Brazil, and each of the 1962 World Cup winning squad was also based in the country. Unfortunately, Santos were not a rich team. Rivals Botafogo counted Didi, Mario Zagallo, Nilton Santo and Garrincha among their numbers. But Santos was still the outstanding side and Pelé was still the outstanding player. Garrincha and the rest were present when Santos beat Botafogo in the 1962 Brazilian Championship final. Pelé scored twice in front of 70,000 as his side won 5-0 in the Maracanã. Though his legacy is defined by international exploits, these were huge games. Pelé scored a hat-trick in the 1961 final against Bahia, the second of which was a stunning goal in which he beat 3 men. In 1963, he scored another hat-trick in a semi-final against Grêmio, before adding 2 goals home and away as Bahia were beaten again to make it 3 in a row. There was another Pelé hat-trick in the 1964 final against Flamengo. He netted again in 1965. In total, Pelé scored 13 goals in 11 championship finals in that 5-year period. His reputation as a big game player during that time in Brazil helped to forge the legend that we know him as today. I must also mention, it was almost impossible for a Brazilian player to move to Europe during that era. So, in a modern context, you would have talents such as Neymar, Gabriel Jesus, Casemiro, Marquinhos, Alisson, Martinelli, Vinicius Jr. and Antony all still playing in the domestic Brazilian league. Even if Pelé was able to move to Europe and play in a league there, he would still score as many, if not more, goals than he would staying in Brazil. This is proven by Pelé's exceptional performance against European clubs. His genius was laid bare against European Cup holders Benfica in the 1962 Intercontinental Cup, the return leg of which Pelé claimed was his best ever game. Having already scored twice in a 3-2 win at the Maracanã, he lit up the Estadio da Luz in Santos' 5-2 second leg victory, scoring a hat-trick and overshadowing home hero Eusebio. There was even a nutmeg of the Portuguese pretender to hammer home the point as Pelé beat a number of opponents to set up another of his side goals. It was a masterclass. Benfica goalkeeper Costa Pereira summed up the mood in Lisbon afterwards. "I arrived hoping to stop a great man," he said of his encounter with Pelé, "but I went away convinced I'd been undone by someone who was not born on the same planet as the rest of us." Santos were back in the Intercontinental Cup action the following year, having retained the Copa Libertadores, this time taking on Nero Rocco's AC Milan after they became European champions for the first time. Pelé only played the first leg, but he scored twice in the San Siro. In 1969, Pelé was back in Milan to compete in a new but short-lived tournament called the Intercontinental Super Cup. Inter were the opponents after a round robin for past winners of the European Cup and Copa Libertadores. There was no doubt about the show's star. Pelé returned to Milan to be admired and managed, once again, to leave the audience satisfied, fawned Corriere dello Sport. Jornal do Brasil was equally effusive. The most beautiful moves of the game were born from his feet. He had an exceptional performance, often causing the crowd to forget that he was an opponent and to applaud him deliriously. Pelé has certainly played against the European giants of his time, and his record in those games were hugely impressive. 8 goals against Inter, 6 against Roma, 3 against Lazio, 2 apiece against Milan and Juventus. In Germany, he scored 6 times in 2 games against Eintracht Frankfurt. In Portugal, he hit a further 4 against Benfica. In Spain, Pelé scored against a great Real Madrid side and notched 3 against Barcelona. English opponents were not spared either. Although many of these matches took place later in his career, he scored twice against Bobby Moore's West Ham and was still going strong in 1972 when Santos embarked in yet another money-spinning tour, this time to Hong Kong. Frank Clark, later to win the European Cup with Nottingham Forest, played against Pelé for Newcastle on that tour and remembers a quiet performance from the icon. For a while, Pelé suddenly decided to turn it on. He scored 3 fantastic goals in about 15 matches. While these matches might have been called friendlies, it would be a mistake to regard them as lesser contests for that reason. Most defenders went into these matches with a point to prove. Pelé was the target, the man to stop. Everyone wanted to test themselves against the legend. The crowds came out in force too. For some of these teams, for some of these players, this was the biggest match of the season. The biggest match of their lives. When Santos went to Plymouth in 1973, there were 37,639 packed into Home Park for a game that one Argyle player described as their cup final. Pelé was just hoping not to be kicked as much as usual. There were 88,000 in attendance when he went to Roma, 85,000 at Barcelona and 72,000 at Hamburg. Some reports even suggest there was a 6-figure crowd in attendance for one of his matches at the San Siro in 1961. The European Cup had emerged from the floodlit games of the 1950s, and this was the continuation of that tradition, showpiece occasions. Much of this video's focus so far has been on goals, because it is more easily quantifiable, but there is still more information about Pelé that you must know. He was no out-and-out striker. Perhaps the most famous showcase of his talent remains his final World Cup in 1970, when Brazil wowed all before them in Mexico. It is a tournament with which he is most associated, not because he was at his best, but because it was televised and in colour. Some of the most famous moments were not goals at all. The attempt from the halfway line against Czechoslovakia, the outrageous dummy against Uruguay, and that save by England goalkeeper Gordon Banks. But what this really tells us is how much Pelé crammed into just 6 games at the World Cup. How much magic did we miss prior to that because the cameras did not catch it? Pelé still scored 4 goals at that tournament, including the opening goal of the final, while his nonchalant assist for Carlos Alberto's goal that sealed the victory might be the most famous pass of them all. It was one of 27 chances that he recreated from open play in that tournament, and his 6th assist. That record hasn't been beaten since, not even by Maradona back in Mexico in 1986. Much like Maradona, Pelé had a remarkable vision. Much like Messi, Pelé was a world-class dribbler. Much like Ronaldo, his heading ability was a key weapon in his arsenal. There was far more to his game than goals. It just so happens that he scored lots and lots of them. To conclude, I believe Edson Arantes do Nascimento, or Pelé, deserves to be known as one of the greatest players in football. Nobody will, or has ever come close to his level, except for one player, the next Pelé. Click this video to find out more.